Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. Very glad to be here. It says on the bottom of my slide, well, it did on my slide, the views expressed are not necessarily those of the Department of Justice. I assume it's not strategic that you took out my disclaimer, Jeff. But it's not. Oh, okay, okay. There we go. Okay. Another disclaimer is that I'm an economist. I'm going to say some things about contracts and court decisions and STB and ICC decisions, and I apologize in advance if I say something foolish that a lawyer would not say, and you can correct me. And the final initial point is that there is not a paper for this presentation yet. I hope there will be, but I'm looking forward to some reactions which will help me inform that paper. Thank you. Copies of the slides. The background to this, and this is not a paper about the CP proposal to buy Norfolk Southern, but it is definitely the background of my thinking on this. So let me lay that background briefly. Many of you know, in November of 2015, CP proposed the deal. They proposed an independent voting trust in kind of a novel way. The standard operating procedure at the ICC and the STB over the years has been that the acquiring railroad acquires the shares of the acquired firm and puts them in an independent voting trust that's run by a trustee. And the ICC/STB makes sure that that trustee is independent and has the right incentives and so forth to avoid the acquiring firm taking control until the regulator can make its ruling. In this case, CPP there were a couple of wrinkles to the proposal. The CP, the acquiring firm, will be placed in the voting trust rather than Norfolk Southern. And the CEO of CP would immediately move to be CEO of Norfolk Southern. In December, Norfolk Southern officially declined this offer. CP sweetened the offer. In December and January, some of the other Class I railroads came out in opposition to this proposal. They can speak for themselves as to what their motivations were. I gather from what they said, I think a lot of the worry was about that this would lead to further consolidation, further concentration that would be politically and regulatorily difficult and unpopular with the shippers. There may have also been some concern that CP was preliminarily or at the beginning was proposing some open access type arrangements to help sweeten the deal for the regulators and DOJ that I expect the other railroads didn't like very much. Anyway, in March, just 3 months ago, CP applied to the STB for approval of the voting trust arrangement. In March also, my agency, the Antitrust Division at Justice, along with some others, including I think the unions, some unions, came out against this voting trust proposal, not against the merger as a whole because we hadn't analyzed it, but against the voting trust proposal. And in April, CP abandoned the deal. All right. Independent voting trusts, as I had the chance to look into some while we were working on this and some later, have quite a long history in U.S. railroads. In fact, going back into the 1800s and early 1900s, most independent voting trusts, at least according to these dusty old books that my librarian found, were in the railroad industry. But they were mostly used because in those early years, there were so many railroad bankruptcies that it became a common pattern for the debtors to take over a bankrupt railroad, appoint an independent trustee, and let that trustee run the railroad. And there was discussion, especially as this model was expanded to other industries. There was the discussion about some of the fairness of this. Burley and Means, in their classic book, took this as an example of the separation of ownership and control that maybe was a little suspicious. I found an early case in 1914 where DOJ won the breakup of a railroad and had the shares of the Boston and Maine put in an independent voting trust until they could be sold. And then the earliest case I've found, which the ICC used these, was in 1929 with a case with the Baltimore and Ohio, in which they allowed the acquiring firm to buy the shares of the target, put them in an independent voting trust, and then wait for the ICC decision, which of course in those days could take quite a long time. CP was quite happy to tell the world in its proposal that even after staggers, this was standing operating procedure. According to CP, I haven't verified it, but according to CP, after 1980, there were 144 proposals of independent voting trusts in railroad mergers, and the STB allowed 144 of them to take place. But in 2001, when the STB issued its ruling regarding Class I major railroad mergers, it announced that it was going to get tougher on independent voting trusts. It said they should be rare, they should not be used routinely. I'm quoting there. The principal concern that STB seemed to have was about the availability of alternative purchasers. As Class I railroads are getting bigger, as they're getting fewer of them, if a Class I railroad gets put into an independent voting trust and then the STB turns down the merger, the argument was there are not that many people who can buy it instead of the acquiring firm. And suddenly you've got this firm whose shares are in a trust that you've got to figure out what to do with. But since 2001, as you know, there has not been a full-fledged Class I railroad merger before the STB. So these new rules, which were had been announced 14 years ago, 15 years ago, including about voting trusts, were not tested. So as I started thinking about voting trusts, it seemed to me that there was sort of a contradiction there. I've got a diagram here from one of the documents that CP produced to try to convince the world that this was a great thing. There's nothing too surprising about it, except that the pointer doesn't seem to work. The proposal is that there's a holding company, and the holding company controls the shares of both railroads. There is an independent trustee that runs one of the railroads. In this case, it was going to be the CP, to make sure that that railroad is run completely independently from the other railroad. In this case, it was going to be Norfolk Southern. So my proposals, or my sort of query, if you will, about voting trusts were, if there's something wrong with this, why has the STB allowed these to take place for 86 years or so in railroad mergers? Again, recently not with Class Is, but with others. And on the other hand, if these are so good for whatever reason, which I'll get to in a minute, why don't we see them in other industries? There's a whole lot of big mergers in the economy that we don't see independent voting trusts with. So sort of an implicit contradiction there. Well, the basic rationale for independent voting trusts isn't that hard. The acquiring firm expends resources to try to decide whether to buy the target or not. It reveals information to the market when it announces that it wants to buy the target. After the announcement, other potential acquirers may free ride on this information and decide, oh yeah, that's right, boy, Norfolk Southern does look like it's ripe for a takeover. I should take them over too. And what an ICC commissioner said, I'm quoting there in 1930, was that if you didn't allow independent voting trusts, then while the ICC was investigating the merger, the price of the acquired firm the price of the share price would go up, and by the end you would be discouraging acquisitions generally. All the gains from the acquisition would go to the target. And somebody else also mentioned, I think this was an economics article, that you would also have a winner's curse problem, that the only time the acquirer wouldn't be outbid was when it was making a mistake. And as Bill Huneke has pointed out to me, this was also, of course, a time when the ICC proceedings and possible court proceedings took a very long time. So there was a long period of uncertainty, and that was one of the reasons why these were imposed. But of course, the problem that I mentioned about winner's curse and about acquirers revealing information is not unique to railroads. Acquirers in any sector face the same problems. And that's, in fact, the rationale for a lot of contractual provisions that we see in merger deals, what are sometimes called lockup tools, including breakup fees that are paid by the target to the acquiring firm if the target ends up accepting a better offer. That, I understand, is absolutely standard now. In the news lately, we've seen a lot about breakup fees that are paid by the acquirer to the target, AT&T, T-Mobile, $4 billion. But as I understand it, again, speaking as a simple economist, it's now absolutely standard practice in a merger deal that there is a breakup fee to be paid by the acquired firm if the deal doesn't go through, in order to compensate the acquirer for its troubles and its costs, in order to reduce the incentive for the acquired firm to immediately start an auction process. And there are other lockup tools. But likewise, target firms face some risks when they are waiting for the Department of Justice or the FCC or the courts to decide what to do. It's well known, and this is why we have the breakup fees going the other way. The target firm, if your firm is about to be bought, and announced it's going to be bought, you lose customers, you lose your best employees. There is, in fact, something, I don't know if I made this up or not, called the Miss Havisham effect, that if you are left at the altar, your stock price actually often falls down below what it was before, because it's assumed that the people who looked at you decided you were even worse than they thought. So your stock price goes back down. So there are all these risks. And in any acquisition, again, DOJ, my agency, FCC for AT&T, T-Mobile, DOT for an airline merger, all these things take a long time. There's nothing unusual now about a merger taking many months, even more than a year. And the capital markets have figured out a way to contract around this. So there are breakup fees on both sides. There are best efforts things on both sides. There are other provisions protecting both sides of the deal and sharing the risk that are absolutely standard now in these deals. So the rest of the world, other industries have figured out how to get along without independent voting trusts. Okay, fine. But still, what's wrong with independent voting trusts? The ICC and the STB over the years have focused on making sure that the trustee was completely independent, the contractual provisions were right, things like that. But what I want to point out here is something that maybe it's very obvious, but once the voting trust is set up, and you can see it on this diagram, the holding company owns the stock of both firms, and the firm which is not run by an independent trustee is run by managers who are reporting to those stockholders who own the stock of both firms. So that if firm B's managers are maximizing shareholder value, they should be considering what happens to both firms when they are taking actions, and the firms are no longer independent. So the problem is clearest if the firms are competitors. If my shareholders also own shares in my competitor, if I gain market share, I don't necessarily want to do it at the expense of my competitor because my shareholders are not going to be happy. In the case of CP and Norfolk Southern, it was more a case of end-to-end. That was going to be more of an end-to-end merger, but still the concerns are there that if you have a vertical relationship, and especially as we've heard all about sunk costs already today, you make long-term, very long-lived investments that maybe favor interchanging traffic with one railroad over another. And if your shareholders in Railroad B also are the shareholders of Railroad A, your incentives are to make sure that Railroad A gets better connections going forward. And there's no way around that from the independence of the trustee. And I've got a citation on the slides to the DOJ filing which made that point. So the conclusion is voting trust arrangements have a long history at the ICC and STB, but they have problems. As the STB noted in 2001, especially as target firms get larger, there may be problems with selling off the target firm if the STB declines the merger. So the STB may be placed in an awkward situation of saying, well, you can't decline it. Nobody else could buy it now. But then DOJ in our filings in 2016, our filing in 2016, pointed out also that this joint ownership created incentive problems, even if you had perfect independence by the firm that was being controlled by the trustee. So my point is, and I'm hoping to put this in a paper, and I'm hoping to have lots of interesting citations to cases and so forth, that voting trusts served a function in capital markets in the railroad business that are now served by a variety of other contractual mechanisms in pretty much every other sector of the economy. And these mechanisms, and maybe they just haven't been studied enough yet, but haven't been shown to suffer from the same incentive problems that I would argue independent voting trusts do. And therefore, query, have independent voting trusts outlived their usefulness as a facilitating mechanism to make the capital market work well in the railroad business? Thank you.
We have time for one or two quick questions.
Hello, Sabine Ahmed from the MITRE Corporation. My question kind of ties back into also the first presentation of the day. So in rail mergers, do you see a lot of these mergers involving foreign direct investment? And in which case, can we say to what extent foreign industrial interests can affect changes in the rail industry? And tying that back into our first presentation where we said, well, perhaps the way to save rail is to divert different kinds of commodities on rail track. And so in which case we could actually get foreign industrial support to bolster rail industry if they are also using it.
It's an interesting question. I'm not really the person to answer it. I will say that I've seen in some other countries, I have seen shipper investments in railroads. Brazil is a good example. I think in Mexico, with some of the consortia there, that have been a good source of private investment for the railroads, but at least in Brazil have also caused lots of competition problems. Because obviously if one shipper has a share in the railroad, there are going to be concerns that that railroad will favor that shipper. And so my understanding is that traditionally the number one source of cases for the CAGE, the competition tribunal in Brazil, has been that iron ore railway that's owned by the dominant iron ore and steel company, and complaints from everybody else. But I think your broader question, you should maybe ask somebody from the STB. I'm not really qualified to. I haven't run into it in the U.S. We always are looking at mergers between two railroad companies.
Okay, with that, thanks, Russ.
All right, thank you.